Comrades, brothers and sisters, it's a very proud and actual fact as a long-standing union activist and Socialist Party member to be invited to speak at this concluding rally. My opening point really is that, and I've no doubt one or two other speakers have touched on this, that capitalism is in crisis and it's official. And if you just indulge me with a couple of quotes which I think reflect the nature of the crisis that we're dealing with. One that struck me comes from Charles Moore, the official biographer of Margaret Thatcher, a former editor of the Daily Telegraph, who recently wrote, "The rich enjoy a global system that allows them to accumulate capital and pay the lowest possible price of labour. The freedom that results applies only to them. The many simply have to work harder in conditions that grow ever more insecure and impoverished to enrich the few." Those are the words of Margaret Thatcher's official biographer. A leading economist in a recent article in the Wall Street Journal, Nouriel Rubino, was quoted, this is again only a few weeks ago. Marx said that while interpreting the world was all very well, the point was to change it. If capitalists want to keep their world safe for capitalism, they need to face up to what's wrong with it and change it fast. Now there's one or two other examples in history where crisis of overproduction, where capitalism has overreached itself. And again, I was just struck with a few examples from the search for non-existent gold deposits in Louisiana, the famous South Sea bubble, where investors were invited to invest in a company for carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. 1929 investment trusts, offshore funds, Latin American loans, the dot-com bubble, and again, wrapping it up, a quote from one of the economists at the European Central Bank, who wrote recently in relation to the Eurozone crisis, "Our great fear is that the crisis is beyond technical regulation and beyond political management. Or as Karl Marx might have put it, all that's solid melts into air." And my point, and the message I think that has to come from this rally, is that it's the ideas of working class solidarity, it's the ideas of socialism that no longer can be dismissed, as people tend to do in recent years, as some utopian dream, but in fact are the most powerful antidote to the new neoliberal consensus from Wall Street to Beijing, taking in Downing Street, Brussels, the studios of News International and the financial markets, all of whom convey the message that they expect our class, the working class, to pay the price for a crisis of their making. Now, of course, we've had 30 years of neoliberalism. We were told it was the route to economic prosperity. All those verities and certainties were shattered in that historic month in September and October 2008. And I'm sure all of us realise that the massive infusion of public money, the deficit, has then become the pretext for the biggest attack on working class living standards that we've seen since the 1920s. Now, I think it was Nye Bevan that used the quote that the Tories never talk about class war because they're too busy practising it. And the true nature of class war and its impact on our class, I was struck by a report from the Centre for Retail Research which showed that in the last 12 months, shoplifting has rapidly increased. And they looked at what are the most the most stolen items. Contrary to the myths in the media, the most common stolen items are not luxuries. Cheese first, meat, alcohol, and scandalously, baby milk. That reveals, what is actually going on, the real material problems and conditions that our class are having to deal with. Now, this attack, of course, has already provoked the inspirational student protests, the brilliant Jarrow March, the biggest demonstrations of disabled people we've ever seen in Britain. On the 26th of March, the biggest trade union demonstration on British soil since the early 80s. On the 30th of June, 750,000 PCS members, college lecturers and teachers out on strike as the first wave of the action against the government's austerity programme. And we now look to the prospect of over 3 million public sector workers striking together on the 30th of November that will constitute the biggest strike in British history. Now, the anticipated raid on public sector pensions is on the face of it the trigger, but of course that strike is an accumulation of grievances built up over many years amongst workers in all parts of the public sector. And the Tories and the Liberals are already starting to realise that you can't build a truth on a lie. We're starting to expose the fallacy that in the 6th richest economy on the planet, you can't afford decent public sector or decent pensions. Again, National Audit Office report, IFS, even the Hutton report indicates that public sector pensions are affordable. And, we're starting to tackle these ideas, the misconceptions about gold-plated pensions, the argument that it should be misery for all because of the attacks on pensions in the private sector, that we should allow that to take place in the public sector as well. That we've also begun to highlight the scandal of pensioner poverty, the need for a proper, decent state pension. All of this is now in the frame and as part of the argument. And that would not be the case if PCS, UCU and the NUT had not taken action on the 30th of November. And that action has delivered not only just the impact and galvanised support for the 30th of November, from a PCS perspective, and apologies if you heard me say this before, but we recruited just short of 8,000 new members in 2 months alone, demonstrating what PCS has learned and the rest of the trade union movement is starting to learn. When unions speak and act on behalf of their members, that's when people join, that's when people become active, that's when they're more likely to support the campaigns that we're involved in. But let's just say, if the government doesn't listen, we need to consider, I know Janice and others have highlighted the question of where next. And PCS is already developing its own strategy amongst its own members, but we want to talk with other public sector unions and make sure that we sustain and coordinate further action. And that must entail further national action after the 30th of November. If that's not enough, that's no excuse for turning down the volume. We need to pick up and escalate pressure on the government, and that will need further national action, particularly before there's any move to impose employee contributions. We need to coordinate a response against the privatisation plans. We're going to coordinate a response amongst call centre workers. We need a UK-wide campaign to secure a UK living wage. We need to be putting pressure on these private contractors hovering around like vultures. We're hoping to win public sector contracts to demand they pay a UK living wage and they give an absolute guarantee for union recognition and bargaining rights. We need to be putting pressure on the devolved authorities in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland to not hide behind the argument that all these cuts are from Westminster. We expect these devolved authorities to use their devolved powers to defend the people in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland against the austerity programme. We also need to start talking in practical ways around international cooperation for days of protest in every major city across Europe on the days of the next phase of industrial action. We've got to reach out and use this opportunity to build support for the trade unions, to reach out to unorganised workers in both the public and the private sector, and in the process we've got to defend any of our members and any of our reps who are victimised by the employer. We've got to build the opposition from the ground up, build links with the occupation movement in Britain and across the world. And finally, let me just say, this crisis opens up the question of what sort of world we want to live in. The public revulsion at the expenses, at MP's expenses scandal, the phone hacking, the scandal around phone hacking and the involvement of using the international, the public revulsion at bankers' bonuses, the soaring fortunes of the super rich. All of this has opened up a political debate. People are looking for answers and their open minds towards socialist ideas. And if I could just finish with one more quote from Zizek, the philosopher who was quoted in The Guardian the other day. Again, it's so important that people have open mind. Well, what he said is merely having an open mind is nothing. The object of opening the mind, as of opening the mouth, is to shut it again on something solid. Well, we're here today to say, confronted with an economic and environmental crisis, that something solid is socialism. It can help us both understand and change the world. Thanks very much for listening.